unforgiving jungles of Vietnam, a shadow loomed, silent, deadly, and relentless. The Viet Cong knew it well. It was the Australian SAS. They feared the night raids, the sudden ambushes, and the ruthless precision of Australian forces. Unlike any other unit, the SAS thrived where others stumbled. For them, the thick jungle wasn't a challenge. It was home. Their tactics were simple yet devastating. And in Vietnam, those tactics would change the course of the war. Imagine being in the jungle, hearing nothing but the whispers of the trees. Every step, every breath counts. You and your mates are out there, completely alone, surrounded by enemy territory. You know the risks, but you trust your training. The enemy doesn't. And in the dead of night, you strike. If you want more stories like this, make sure to subscribe, like, and share. Chapter 1. The arrival of the Australian SAS in Vietnam. The dense jungle of Vietnam felt like a living beast. The heat was stifling, the air thick with moisture and the scent of damp earth. For the soldiers of the Australian Special Air Service, SAS, it was a completely new world. One that was both deadly and unforgiving. They had trained for this moment, but no amount of preparation could ever truly capture the harsh reality of the jungle. In 1966, Australia sent its elite force to Vietnam. The SAS was tasked with taking on a mission unlike any they had faced before. Unlike conventional armies that would line up in vast formations, the SAS thrived in small, highly mobile units that struck quickly and disappeared without a trace. They didn't march through fields. They operated in the shadows. Imagine being a soldier in this environment. Your patrol is small, no more than a dozen men, and every step you take could be your last. The jungle is silent, but in that silence, danger is waiting. The Viet Cong are out there watching. They know the terrain well, but so do you. The difference is you've been trained for this. How to move silently, how to read the jungle, how to outthink the enemy. The SAS soldiers were trained to move without making a sound. Every step, every breath had to be controlled. One wrong move could give their position away. They operated in two-man teams, spaced out to cover more ground and minimize the chance of being detected. Each soldier knew the importance of staying alert, remaining hyper-aware of every crack, every rustle. Every member of the team had to be trusted completely, and they knew it. The soldiers had to adjust to the environment quickly. The jungle was thick with foliage that made movement slow and cumbersome. Sweat poured down their faces, stinging their eyes. The heat was relentless. But worse were the insects, mosquitoes, leeches, and other creatures that made it nearly impossible to remain comfortable for even a second. But in the SAS, discomfort was just part of the job. The first weeks in Vietnam were a test. The soldiers began to understand the challenge of constant vigilance. They weren't just fighting an enemy. They were fighting the environment itself. The oppressive heat drained their energy. The constant threat of ambush, the need for noise discipline, and the physical strain of carrying their equipment weighed on their bodies. But the mental toll was perhaps the hardest part. Every moment was filled with the uncertainty of whether today would be the day they encountered the enemy. The paranoia that came with being in a hostile territory where the enemy could be anywhere was real. The psychological challenges were evident. Soldiers had to keep their minds sharp despite the exhaustion, the discomfort, and the fear that came with being in enemy territory. They couldn't let the fatigue overwhelm them. They couldn't let their guard down for even a second. Every shadow, every movement in the bushes was a potential threat. Their training had prepared them for this, but no amount of preparation could fully prepare them for the reality of combat in such a hostile environment. As the days went by, the Australian SAS began to develop their tactics. They weren't fighting traditional battles. They were learning to outwit the Viet Cong, using the jungle to their advantage. The SAS soldiers became experts in stealth. Their ability to move unseen and unheard became their greatest asset. They moved swiftly, striking without warning, and then disappearing into the dense jungle before the enemy had a chance to retaliate. But it wasn't just the tactics that set the SAS apart. It was their mindset. These men were calm under fire. They trusted each other completely. Every soldier knew that his life depended on the man beside him. The bond that formed between them in the jungle was unbreakable. They were a team, and each member played a crucial role in ensuring the success of their mission. There were times, however, when doubt crept in. The exhaustion, the fear, and the relentless pressure of the jungle weighed heavily on the men. But in those moments, they relied on their training, their camaraderie, and their mission. The sense of purpose kept them going. They knew that they were the ones who could change the course of the war. They were the ones who could do what no one else could. For the Australian SAS, the first encounters with the Viet Cong were a test of both their skills and their resilience. The enemy was ruthless, but the SAS was relentless. In those early days, the men of the SAS began to understand the true meaning of warfare in Vietnam. They would have to adapt, evolve, and become something more than just soldiers. They would have to become ghosts, silent, deadly, and impossible to catch. And the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. The SAS soldiers honed their skills. The jungle became their home, and they learned to move through it like shadows. Their small teams began to strike fear into the Viet Cong. The enemy, who once had the advantage, now found themselves outmatched by a force they couldn't see and couldn't predict. But this was just the beginning. The SAS had only scratched the surface of what they were capable of. As their operations expanded, so did their reputation. The Viet Cong, once confident, were beginning to feel the effects of the Australian SAS's relentless attacks. The tide of the war was about to shift. Chapter 2. The Rise of Guerrilla Tactics. The dense jungle that had once felt like an overwhelming, inescapable enemy was now the Australian SAS's domain. After weeks of adapting to the harsh environment, the SAS soldiers had become experts in guerrilla warfare. They didn't wait for the enemy to come to them. They took the fight to the Viet Cong, striking when least expected, then vanishing into the wilderness before the enemy could retaliate. By now, the SAS had learned that traditional tactics would not work in Vietnam. The jungles were too thick for large formations to maneuver, and conventional combat would result in heavy casualties. Instead, the SAS soldiers had embraced small unit tactics that allowed them to move swiftly and decisively. Their operations were marked by speed, stealth, and surprise, qualities that made them feared by the Viet Cong and respected by their allies. The core of the SAS's strategy was the ambush. In the jungle, where visibility was limited and the enemy could be anywhere, ambushes were the perfect tactic. SAS soldiers would lay in wait, blending in with the terrain, their faces smeared with mud to help them remain unseen. Then, with deadly precision, they would strike, overwhelming their targets, before they even had a chance to react. They operated in small teams of no more than 8 to 10 men, each one trained to move silently and work in perfect unison. They relied on surprise and speed, never staying in one place too long. Imagine being on one of these patrols, moving silently through the thick jungle, your senses heightened with every step. Every leaf, every sound could be the difference between life and death. You know your team trusts you, and you trust them. But even then, the tension is unbearable. The Viet Cong could be out there, watching, waiting for their chance to strike. The SAS had developed a unique style of patrols. They moved in a staggered line, spaced out to minimize the chances of an ambush. Their spacing allowed them to cover more ground, but it also meant that if the enemy attacked, they would have to rely on each other to get through it. Each man had a role to play. One couldn't afford to make mistakes. If one soldier slipped, the entire patrol was at risk. This sense of shared responsibility created an unbreakable bond between the men. They lived and fought together in the jungle, and they had to trust each other completely. The psychological toll of constant vigilance and fear was very immense, but the camaraderie within the SAS helped them endure it. Their ability to work as a cohesive unit was what set them apart from other forces. The environment itself added to the difficulty. The heat and humidity were relentless, making every movement feel like an effort. The jungle was teeming with dangerous creatures, snakes, spiders, and other predators, and the soldiers had to stay alert to avoid them. But it wasn't just the physical environment that took its toll. It was the mental strain, the constant fear of ambush, the pressure to stay silent, and the uncertainty of what was ahead all weighed on the soldiers. Yet, through it all, they maintained their discipline, knowing that one mistake could be fatal. The SAS had also perfected the art of silent movement. They had been trained to move without making a sound, and that skill was critical in their success. The jungle could be noisy with the rustling of leaves and the sounds of animals, but even in that cacophony, the SAS soldiers moved like ghosts. Their boots were soft, their movements deliberate, and their senses sharp. Every step was calculated, every sound carefully monitored. If a soldier stepped on a branch or rustled a leaf, it could mean detection. The SAS understood that silence was their greatest weapon. But silence wasn't just about avoiding detection. It was about building a sense of fear and uncertainty within the enemy. The Viet Cong had been used to fighting conventional forces, soldiers who would march in, announce their presence, and engage in battle. But the SAS were different. They came in silence, struck quickly, and disappeared without a trace. The Viet Cong had no idea where the next attack would come from, or when it would hit. One of the most successful tactics employed by the SAS was the night raid. The cover of darkness gave them the perfect opportunity to strike, and the Viet Cong, who relied heavily on their own ambushes, were caught off guard. These night raids were swift and brutal. The SAS would infiltrate enemy camps, silently take out key targets, and leave before the Viet Cong even realized they had been attacked. The fear this tactic instilled in the enemy was profound. The Viet Cong knew they could be attacked at any time, day or night, and that knowledge began to eat away at their morale. The psychological impact of the SAS's operations on the Viet Cong cannot be overstated. The constant attacks, the unpredictability, and the fear of never knowing when or where the next raid would come from had a profound effect on their soldiers. It created a sense of paranoia, forcing the Viet Cong to waste resources on defense and diminishing their ability to mount effective offensives. As the SAS continued their operations, their reputation grew. The Viet Cong, once confident in their ability to control the jungles, now found themselves outmatched by a force they couldn't see, couldn't predict, and couldn't defeat. The SAS had turned the tide in Vietnam with their small unit tactics, their discipline, and their relentless drive. But the SAS's success was not without its costs. The physical and mental strain of constant operations took its toll on the soldiers. The long hours of vigilance, the constant fear of ambush, and the ever-present danger of the jungle wore on them. Yet despite these challenges, they kept pushing forward, knowing that their efforts were making a difference. They were changing the course of the war, one silent step at a time. Chapter 3. The tide turns. High-profile missions and rising fear. By the time the Australian SAS had been in Vietnam for several months, their reputation was growing. The small, stealthy raids, executed with surgical precision, were not only striking fear into the hearts of the Viet Cong, they were changing the very nature of the war. The SAS wasn't just fighting. They were forcing the enemy to rethink their strategies. No longer could the Viet Cong rely on their traditional methods. The threat of an attack could come at any time, anywhere, and the terror of their sudden, unseen presence began to have a significant impact on morale. It wasn't long before the SAS were tasked with high-profile missions that would strike at the heart of the Viet Cong's supply chains and leadership. These operations required even more precision, more discipline, and an unshakable trust between the soldiers. The SAS didn't rely on overwhelming force. Instead, they used tactics that exploited weaknesses and made the most of their environment. One mission in particular would come to define the SAS's role in Vietnam. The operation was simple in concept, but extremely difficult in execution. A key Viet Cong supply depot, vital for the enemy's logistics, was located deep within jungle territory. The depot was heavily guarded, and the Viet Cong had fortified it with traps and sentries. This would be no ordinary raid, but if the SAS succeeded, it could cripple the enemy's supply lines and change the course of the war. Imagine being one of the men tasked with this mission. You're already deep in enemy territory. You know that one mistake could cost lives, but you also know the stakes. disrupt the Viet Cong's ability to resupply, and you strike a blow that could shift the balance of power. The pressure is unbearable, but you've trained for this. The constant stress, the fear of detection, it's all part of the job. You move quietly, your heart racing with every step. Every rustle of leaves could be the enemy. Every movement calculated. The SAS soldiers knew the importance of maintaining noise discipline. Each step must be measured, each breath controlled. The jungle, thick and oppressive, offered some cover, but it also made them vulnerable. If they couldn't move without making a sound, the mission would fail. There was no room for error. The closer they got to the supply depot, the more dangerous it became. The Viet Cong knew the area well, and they had set up traps, tripwires, hidden mines, and watchful sentries. But the SAS had trained for this. They had prepared for every possible contingency. They moved with a calm, deliberate pace, checking each step, scanning the jungle for signs of the enemy. The mission was a success, but not without its challenges. The SAS managed to infiltrate the depot, taking out key targets and crippling the Viet Cong's ability to resupply. The attack was swift, leaving no time for retaliation, but the psychological impact on the Viet Cong was immense. The enemy now knew they weren't safe. The SAS could strike anywhere, at any time, and they were not afraid to hit hard. But this success came at a price. The constant pressure of these high-stakes missions, the fear of being discovered, the knowledge that death was always just one mistake away, began to take its toll on the men. The emotional strain was evident. Even the most hardened soldiers had moments where the weight of their actions seemed too much to bear. But in those moments, they relied on each other. They had forged bonds that could never be broken, bonds that would carry them through the toughest of times. The operations became more frequent, and as the SAS proved time and time again that they could strike at the heart of the enemy, the Viet Cong's fear deepened. The unpredictability of the SAS's tactics began to spread through the Viet Cong ranks. Soldiers who had once been confident in their ability to control the jungle now found themselves looking over their shoulders, wondering when the next attack would come. But fear wasn't the only thing the SAS was instilling in the enemy. They were sowing confusion. The Viet Cong never knew when or where the next raid would strike. The SAS had become a force of nature, a shadow that moved through the jungle with terrifying speed and precision. The Viet Cong couldn't track them, couldn't anticipate their moves, and that uncertainty began to undermine their confidence. This shift in the balance of power didn't go unnoticed by the American forces either. The SAS's success forced them to rethink their own strategies. At the time, American forces were still relying heavily on conventional warfare, large formations, heavy artillery, and airstrikes. But the SAS showed that small, highly trained units operating in the shadows could have a far greater impact. The fear that the Viet Cong felt now had ripple effects, reaching the highest levels of command. The success of the SAS was no longer just about strategy, it was about shifting the entire approach to warfare in Vietnam. As the SAS continued their operations, their impact became more evident. Each successful mission, each strike against key Viet Cong positions sent a clear message. The tide of war was turning. The SAS had found a way to fight that the enemy couldn't counter. Their use of stealth, surprise, and precision had become their trademark, and the Viet Cong had no answer. But even as the SAS inflicted heavy losses on the enemy, the psychological toll on the soldiers continued to grow. Each mission brought new challenges, new risks. The fear, the constant vigilance, and the uncertainty were taking their toll. The soldiers pushed forward, driven by a sense of duty and camaraderie, but the war was slowly wearing them down. Despite the toll, the SAS continued to rise in prominence. They had become a force that no one could ignore. Their missions were more daring, their tactics more refined, and with each operation, they not only struck fear into the Viet Cong, they changed the way the war was fought. Chapter 4. Turning the Tide. The strategic impact of the SAS. As the Australian SAS gained more experience into the dense jungles of Vietnam, they began to recognize that their efforts were having a larger strategic impact than anyone had anticipated. What had started as small-scale raids and ambushes against isolated Viet Cong units had grown into an operation that disrupted the very core of the Viet Cong's operations. The SAS was not just creating fear. They were dismantling the enemy's ability to fight. The missions became bigger, more ambitious, and more decisive. The SAS understood the value of cutting off the enemy's supply lines. Without supplies, food, weapons, ammunition, the Viet Cong were nothing. In this chapter, we explore how the SAS began targeting the lifeblood of the Viet Cong's war effort, forcing the enemy into a corner where their very survival was at stake. Imagine being a soldier on one of these missions. You're deep in enemy territory, far from the nearest support. The humidity of the jungle weighs heavily on you as you carry your equipment. Everything you need to survive is on your back. Each step is heavy with the knowledge that you're operating in a zone where the enemy could be anywhere, and there's no help coming if you're discovered. But there is a strange confidence among the men. They've been through this before, and they've seen what their tactics can do. You trust your training. You trust your mates. You trust that when you strike, it'll be with the precision and speed you've perfected over the months. This isn't the first time you've moved into hostile territory, and it won't be the last. But this mission, this one feels different. The stakes have never been higher. The SAS had perfected their ability to slip into enemy territory, strike decisively, and disappear before the Viet Cong could react. Now they began focusing on the enemy's supply depots and critical infrastructure. These were vital targets because without supplies, the Viet Cong couldn't continue fighting. They couldn't survive. And as the SAS systematically destroyed key supply lines, the Viet Cong were forced to operate in a much more limited and desperate manner. One particularly significant operation took place in a region known for its dense jungle and complex network of Viet Cong supply routes. The SAS had received intelligence about a large cache of weapons and medical supplies hidden in a remote area. A direct assault was out of the question. Too many traps, too many sentries. Instead, the SAS soldiers planned an ambush. They infiltrated the area under cover of darkness, using the jungle to conceal their movements. Once inside, they waited in silence, watching the movements of the Viet Cong with patience and precision. Then, when the time was right, they struck. The Viet Cong had no idea what hit them. In a matter of minutes, the SAS destroyed the supplies and slipped away without leaving a trace. The impact was immense. The enemy was left scrambling to replace the lost supplies, and their confidence began to waver. This raid wasn't just another attack. It was a clear message. The SAS could reach them anywhere, anytime, and with deadly precision. No supply route was safe. But while the tactical success was clear, the psychological impact was perhaps even more profound. For the Viet Cong, who had prided themselves on their control of the jungles, this attack felt like a blow to the very heart of their war effort. It was no longer a question of if they would be struck. It was when and where. The element of surprise had turned the tide, and the SAS had perfected it. The disruption caused by the SAS raids was widespread. The Viet Cong, who had once operated with near impunity, were now forced to move cautiously, setting up decoys and false trails to confuse their attackers. They couldn't keep up with the unpredictable nature of the SAS attacks. What had once been a war of attrition, where the Viet Cong had time to regroup and plan, was now a race to stay one step ahead of an enemy that could strike at any time, in any place. The SAS also began to realize that they were not just making tactical raids. They were changing the enemy's mindset. The Viet Cong soldiers, once confident in their ability to fight and evade larger forces, began to fear their small elite enemies. They didn't have the resources to conduct large-scale operations to counter the SAS. They were being forced into an asymmetrical fight where the rules had changed. The psychological warfare the SAS waged was as effective as their physical strikes. By now, the Viet Cong had learned that a single small patrol could devastate their operations. The fear of SAS raids grew with every mission. This shift in psychological dominance was a critical turning point. It wasn't just the destruction of supplies or the killing of key Viet Cong personnel. It was the erosion of the Viet Cong's will to continue fighting. The SAS's success also had a profound effect on the morale of their own troops. As the mission success rate increased, so did their confidence. The soldiers, who had been uncertain in the beginning, now believed in their ability to outsmart and outfight the Viet Cong. This was not just about surviving the jungle. This was about winning. But it wasn't just the SAS's success in Vietnam that was changing the war. It was the lessons learned in the field. The operations in Vietnam were shaping the future of modern special forces. The techniques and tactics the SAS employed would be studied and refined in future conflicts, becoming the backbone of special operations forces worldwide. While the Viet Cong were on the defensive, the SAS was evolving. They understood that the war wasn't just about killing. It was about breaking the enemy's spirit. The destruction of their supplies, the constant threat of ambush, and the ever-present fear of the unknown were all part of a larger strategy to collapse the Viet Cong's ability to resist. And as the SAS continued their relentless operations, it was clear that their impact on the war was undeniable. The battle for Vietnam was far from over, but the tide had shifted. The Viet Cong were no longer in control of the jungles. They were the ones now on the defensive, and the SAS had shown them just how vulnerable they really were. Chapter 5. Legacy of the SAS. A changing war. By the end of 1967, the Australian SAS had firmly established itself as a critical force in the Vietnam War. Their relentless, precise strikes had not only changed the tactical landscape of the conflict, they had reshaped the very way warfare was conducted in the jungle. The SAS had pushed the limits of small unit tactics, using their unmatched stealth, speed, and precision to undermine the Viet Cong's strength and morale. But while the tactical victories piled up, the true impact of their operations was far-reaching, affecting the course of the war and the future of modern special forces. The final chapter of the SAS's campaign in Vietnam was defined not just by their continued operations, but by their enduring legacy. As the war dragged on, the Viet Cong's ability to fight effectively diminished. The constant disruption of their supply chains, the relentless night raids, and the psychological warfare had broken their will to continue. The Viet Cong, once a formidable force capable of holding their ground against larger armies, had been outsmarted by an enemy that used the jungle as its weapon and time as its ally. The SAS had proven that unconventional tactics, when executed with skill and precision, could defeat even the most entrenched forces. But the war was far from over. The political and military landscape was shifting, and the role of the SAS was evolving. As the Australian forces began to scale back their operations, the SAS soldiers looked back on their time in Vietnam, not just with pride, but with a sense of accomplishment that few others in the war could claim. They had done what was thought impossible, confronting the Viet Cong head-on and beating them at their own game. The success of the SAS in Vietnam didn't just change the outcome of one war. It changed the way future wars would be fought. The techniques that the SAS had perfected, the ambushes, the stealth tactics, the use of small, highly skilled teams, became the cornerstone of modern special operations. It was no longer about overwhelming force or conventional combat. Instead, it was about precision, about understanding the terrain, and about fighting with an adaptability that few others had. But as the SAS soldiers returned to Australia, the toll of the war became clearer. The psychological strain of constant combat, the unrelenting fear, the isolation of small unit operations in hostile territory, these were experiences that left scars. Many of the SAS soldiers who returned from Vietnam found it difficult to reintegrate into civilian life. The camaraderie they had built during their time in the jungle, the unspoken bond between them, could never be replicated. The war had taken more than just their youth. It had taken pieces of their souls. For the soldiers who survived, the end of the war did not mean an end to the psychological battles. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, which was not widely understood at the time, began to take its toll on many veterans. The memories of the constant danger, the fear of being ambushed, and the pressure to perform at their best in life or death situations stayed with them long after the fighting stopped. Many would carry these memories for the rest of their lives. Yet, despite the emotional and physical toll of the war, the soldiers of the SAS had a unique sense of pride. They knew they had been part of something greater than themselves, a force that had not only changed the course of the war, but had redefined the role of special forces in modern warfare. They had fought not just for victory, but for a sense of honor and duty that transcended the battlefield. In Vietnam, they had proven that small groups of highly skilled soldiers working in unison could overcome even the most formidable enemies. As the years passed, the legacy of the SAS in Vietnam became more than just a story of military tactics. It became a symbol of resilience, determination, and adaptability. The SAS had faced insurmountable odds and had come out victorious. Their legacy lived on in the special forces units that followed them, from the British SAS to the US, Navy SEALs and beyond. The lessons learned in the jungles of Vietnam continued to shape modern military strategy, and their ethos of precision and stealth still serves as the foundation for special operations around the world. The SAS soldiers who served in Vietnam knew they had done their part in history. They had fought in one of the most grueling, unforgiving wars of the 20th century, and had left a mark on military history that would be remembered for generations. But for them, the true measure of success was not just the missions they completed, or the victories they won. It was the unbreakable bond they shared, the camaraderie and trust that had kept them alive in the jungle, and the knowledge that they had done something few others had the courage to attempt. And as the final soldiers of the SAS returned home, their mission was clear that they had not just fought a war, they had changed the way wars would be fought in the future. The lessons of Vietnam, learned in the darkness of the jungle and under the constant threat of death, would echo for years to come.